What does it mean to be King of England when you speak French, rule lands across half of France, and spend only 6 months of a 10-year reign on English soil? When your reputation as a warrior becomes more valuable than your presence as an administrator. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There are rulers whose legend overwhelms their actual governance, whose military achievements obscure the political structures they neglected. Tonight, we turn to a king whose image as the ideal Christian warrior masked the reality of an absentee ruler managing a vast continental empire from battlefields and prisons. We ask whether medieval kingship required presence or merely reputation, and what it cost to build a legend while neglecting a kingdom.
Richard I of England spent most of his reign outside England, fighting crusades in the Holy Land and wars in France. Yet his contemporaries considered him one of the greatest kings of his age, not despite his absence, but in part because of it, because medieval kingship was measured more by military prowess and chivalric reputation than chivalric reputation by administrative competence.
We are speaking about Richard the Lionheart.
Richard I was King of England from 1189 to 1199, ruler of the Angevin Empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a military commander who became the defining figure of the Third Crusade, and whose reign illuminated the tension between kingship as personal martial leadership and kingship as territorial administration in the medieval world.
Then, let us begin with the inheritance that made Richard both powerful and overburdened.
Richard was born in 1157 at Oxford, the third surviving son of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His birth into this family placed him at the center of the most complex political structure in medieval Europe. Henry II controlled what historians call the Angevin Empire, though it was not an empire in any formal sense. It was a collection of territories held through different legal relationships. England as a kingdom, Normandy and Anjou as duchies, Aquitaine through marriage to Eleanor. For all these continental lands, Henry was technically a vassal of the French king, though in practice he controlled more of France than the king himself did. This created a structural absurdity. The King of England owed feudal homage to the King of France for lands that made him more powerful than his feudal superior.
So, the political geography was built on a contradiction that guaranteed future conflict.
Exactly. Richard grew up primarily in Aquitaine, his mother's duchy in southwestern France. Eleanor was one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, duchess in her own right, former Queen of France through her first marriage, and a patron of troubadour culture and courtly literature. Richard was raised speaking French, trained in warfare and chivalric culture, and designated from childhood to inherit Aquitaine. He was 12 years old when he was formally invested as Duke. England was distant and foreign to him, but here is where it shifts. Henry tried to delegate authority while retaining actual power, naming his sons as rulers of different regions, but refusing independent control.
So they had titles without power, which is a recipe for resentment.
Exactly. Richard's older brother, also named Henry, was crowned as junior king during their father's lifetime, a practice meant to ensure smooth succession. But the young king had no real authority and grew increasingly frustrated. In 1173, the young King Henry rebelled against his father, supported by his mother Eleanor and his brothers Richard and Geoffrey. The rebellion was encouraged by Louis VII of France, who saw an opportunity to weaken the Angevin dominions. The rebellion failed. Henry II crushed it, imprisoned Eleanor, and reasserted control over his sons, but the pattern of family conflict had been established. Richard would spend much of his youth fighting either for or against his father and brothers.
So, Richard learned warfare not through foreign campaigns but through civil war within his own family.
Yes, and he became exceptionally skilled at it. Richard spent the 1170s and 1180s campaigning in Aquitaine, suppressing rebellious barons, fighting his brothers, and occasionally fighting alongside his father against external threats. His military reputation grew rapidly. He was known for aggressive tactics, personal courage in battle, and skill in siege warfare. Medieval warfare was primarily about taking and holding castles, and Richard mastered both the engineering and the psychology of sieges. In 1183, the young King Henry passed away during another rebellion against their father. This made Richard the eldest surviving son and heir to England. But it also created new conflicts, because Henry II began to favor his youngest son John, attempting to redistribute lands in John's favor.
So becoming heir did not end the family conflict, it intensified it.
Exactly. By 1187, Richard was again in open conflict with his father. This time, he allied with Philip II of France, who had succeeded his father Louis in 1180. Philip was young, ambitious, and understood that the Angevin Empire was vulnerable to internal division. The war between Richard and Philip on one side, and Henry II. In July 1189, he was forced to accept humiliating peace terms that recognized Richard as his heir and required him to pay homage to Philip. Henry passed away 2 days later at Chinon, reportedly cursing his sons. Richard became King of England at age 31, inheriting the most extensive dominions in Western Europe, and a legacy of family betrayal.
So Richard gained the crown through rebellion against his own father.
Yes, and this context is essential for understanding what followed. Richard was crowned in Westminster in September 1189. He spent approximately 4 months in England organizing his government and, crucially, raising money. Because Richard had already committed to joining the Third Crusade, Jerusalem had fallen to Saladin in 1187, shocking Christian Europe. The crusade to reclaim it was being organized by the 3 most powerful rulers in the West: Richard, Philip II, and the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Crusading was enormously expensive. Richard needed to fund an army, fleet, supplies for a campaign of uncertain duration thousands of miles from home. He sold offices, titles, and privileges. He reportedly said he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer.
So his first act as king was to extract maximum revenue from England to fund an expedition that would take him away from England.
Exactly. Richard left England in December 1189 and would not return for 4 years. He left the kingdom under the administration of 2 justiciars, but real power was contested between his brother John and the Chancellor William Longchamp. Richard travelled to the Holy Land by sea, stopping in Sicily where he became embroiled in local politics. His sister Joan was the widow of the Sicilian king, and Richard intervened militarily to secure her rights and extract money from the new regime. He also conquered Cyprus in 1191, deposing its ruler, and establishing it as a strategic base for crusading operations. This was militarily brilliant but politically revealing. Richard treated crusading not as religious pilgrimage but as an extension of his territorial warfare.
So even on crusade, he was operating as a king, expanding his domains.
Yes, Richard arrived in the Holy Land in June 1191 and immediately took command of the siege of Acre, which had been ongoing for 2 years. His arrival transformed the siege. He brought siege engines, fresh troops, and aggressive leadership. Acre fell in July 1191, but the victory was followed by an atrocity. When the Muslim garrison's ransom terms were not met quickly enough by Saladin, Richard ordered the execution of approximately 3,000 prisoners. It was a calculated act of terror meant to demonstrate that he would not be delayed by negotiations. The crusade then moved south along the coast toward Jerusalem. Richard won a significant victory at the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191, defeating Saladin in open battle and demonstrating the superiority of Western heavy cavalry when properly deployed.
So Richard was achieving military success where previous crusaders had failed.
Yes, but Jerusalem remained out of reach. Richard advanced to within sight of the city twice, but never attempted an assault. The strategic problem was that even if he captured Jerusalem, he could not hold it without a permanent garrison and supply line, and he could not maintain those while his continental domains were under threat from Philip of France. Philip had left the crusade after Acre fell, returning to France. Richard received reports that Philip was conspiring with John to seize Angevin territories, while Richard was absent. The political cost of remaining in the east was becoming unsustainable. In September 1192, Richard negotiated a 3-year truce with Saladin. The truce left Jerusalem in Muslim hands but secured Christian access to holy sites, and established a coastal strip from Tyre to Jaffa under Crusader control. Richard had not achieved the Crusade's stated objective, but he had stabilized the military situation.
So the crusade ended not with triumph, but with a pragmatic compromise.
Exactly. Richard left the Holy Land in October 1192. He attempted to travel overland through Central Europe, but he was recognized and captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria. Leopold had fought alongside Richard in the crusade, but had been publicly humiliated by him at Acre. He handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who saw an opportunity to extract enormous ransom from the richest kingdom in the West. Richard was held captive for more than a year, from December 1192 to February 1194. The ransom demanded was 150,000 marks, an almost inconceivable sum equal to 2 or 3 years of English royal revenue.
So England had to pay for both the crusade and the ransom.
Yes, the collection of the ransom placed extraordinary strain on English finances and administration. Every landholder was taxed. Church plate was confiscated. It was the largest financial exaction in English history to that point. During Richard's captivity, Philip of France and John attempted to take advantage. Philip invaded Normandy. John tried to seize power in England, claiming Richard was dead or would never return. But Richard's administrators in England remained loyal, and the ransom was eventually paid. Richard was released in February 1194 and returned to England. He spent 2 months there, primarily to reassert his authority and punish John's supporters. Then he left for Normandy and never returned to England. He spent the last 5 years of his life fighting Philip of France.
So, out of a 10-year reign, Richard spent approximately 6 months in England.
Yes, and this is the central fact that has to be understood about Richard. He was not really King of England in any meaningful cultural or political sense. He was a French-speaking continental lord, who happened to hold the English crown as one title among many. His wars against Philip in the 1190s were fought over control of the continental Angevin territories. Normandy was far more important to Richard than England, because losing Normandy would cut the Angevin Empire in half and expose all his other French lands to Philip's expansion. Richard constructed a massive fortress called Chateau Gaillard to defend the approaches to Rouen, the capital of Normandy. It was one of the most advanced military structures of the medieval period, designed with overlapping fields of fire, concentric defenses, and provisions for prolonged siege.
So, his architectural legacy was a fortress in France, not in England.
Exactly. In 1199, Richard was besieging a minor castle at Chalus in the Limousin when he was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected. Richard passed away on the 6th of April 1199 at age 41. He left no legitimate children. Within 5 years, John would lose Normandy, Anjou, and most of the continental Angevin territories to Philip. The empire Richard had fought to defend would collapse.
So Richard's reign set the conditions for the loss of everything he had tried to preserve.
Yes, and yet Richard's contemporary reputation was extraordinary. The troubadours composed verses about his prowess. Even Muslim chroniclers acknowledged his military skill. This reputation was not accidental. Richard cultivated it deliberately. He understood that in the feudal world, where loyalty was personal and military leadership was the core duty of kingship, reputation could substitute for presence.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret. Margaret, for those who want to understand Richard beyond the legend, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Richard I by John Gillingham.
So this is a book that moves beyond the romantic image to examine the political realities.
Precisely. Gillingham offers a historically grounded reassessment of Richard, examining his reign within the political realities of the Angevin Empire and the wider European balance of power. The book moves beyond legend to explore Richard as both military leader and ruler, situating his crusading campaigns, continental wars, and political decisions within the structural tensions of medieval kingship.
Is it accessible to someone without deep background in medieval politics?
It is thorough and assumes some familiarity with the period, but Gillingham writes clearly and builds necessary context as he proceeds. A reader willing to engage with the complexity of feudal relationships will find it rewarding. What makes it particularly valuable is that it takes Richard seriously as a political actor rather than dismissing him as either a perfect hero or an irresponsible adventurer.
So reading it gives you Richard as he actually operated, not as legend presents him.
Exactly. For anyone who wants to understand how medieval kingship actually functioned, Gillingham provides the essential framework.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Richard's reign operates on multiple contradictory levels. The first level is military and strategic. Richard was genuinely one of the most skilled military commanders of the medieval period. His tactical innovations, his use of siege warfare, his understanding of logistics and supply, all were exceptional. But his military success did not translate into political stability. He won battles but could not secure peace. He held territory but could not build institutions to govern it in his absence. His reign demonstrated both the power and the limits of personal martial kingship.
So he embodied medieval kingship at its peak and exposed its fundamental inadequacy.
Exactly. The second level is financial and administrative. Richard's reign placed crushing fiscal demands on England. The Crusade, the ransom, the Continental Wars, all required extraction of unprecedented sums from English resources. Yet England's administrative structures proved capable of meeting those demands. The exchequer, the system of sheriffs and justices, the legal framework, all functioned effectively in Richard's absence. This revealed that medieval government could operate without the king's constant presence if the institutions were sound. Richard's brother John would inherit a kingdom with sophisticated governance but depleted finances. The institutional capacity was there, the resources had been exhausted. That combination would contribute to John's eventual political crisis and the Magna Carta.
So Richard's extraction of resources from England inadvertently created the conditions for constitutional limits on royal power.
Yes, the third level is cultural and symbolic. Richard became, during his lifetime and after, the embodiment of chivalric kingship. He was the warrior king who fought Saladin, who took the cross, who never retreated from battle. This image was cultivated deliberately. Richard patronized troubadours and chroniclers who celebrated his deeds. He understood that in a feudal system where loyalty was personal, reputation secured allegiance as effectively as presence. The legend of Richard the Lionheart became a political asset that outlasted the man. Later, English kings would invoke his memory to legitimize their own military campaigns. The crusading ideal he embodied would shape European politics for centuries.
So the symbolic capital he generated exceeded the actual territories he controlled.
Exactly. Fourth level is the question of what medieval kingship actually required. Richard's reign forces us to ask whether a king needed to be present in his kingdom, or whether effective delegation made physical presence unnecessary. For Richard, kingship was fundamentally military. A king's duty was to lead armies, defend his lands, expand his territories when possible. Administrative governance was secondary, something that could be delegated to competent officials. This model worked as long as the king won his wars and the officials remained loyal, but it was inherently unstable. It required continuous military success, which was impossible to sustain. It created power vacuums that ambitious subordinates could exploit.
So Richard's approach to kingship was viable only under conditions of constant victory.
Yes, and those conditions could not last. Richard passed away fighting over a minor castle of questionable strategic value. The wound was not from a great battle, but from a siege of a rebel baron's fortification. It was an absurd end for the greatest warrior of the age. The deeper question is whether Richard's reign represents medieval kingship at its apex or its crisis. He embodied all the values the feudal world celebrated: courage, military skill, chivalric honor. Yet his reign also exposed the limitations of those values as a basis for stable governance. Contemporary politics still grapples with versions of this tension. Military success is valued over administrative competence. Reputation management becomes a substitute for effective governance.
So Richard's legacy is both a medieval story and a modern warning about the gap between image and substance.
Exactly. Richard the Lionheart was not a bad king by the standards of his time. He fulfilled the expectations placed on medieval rulers. But those expectations, centered on personal martial prowess rather than institutional development, were inadequate for the complex territorial politics of the Angevin Empire. The territories Richard defended through warfare would be lost by his brother through diplomatic and administrative failure. The legend Richard built would endure in literature and popular culture for centuries, long after the political structures he fought to preserve had collapsed.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the reign of a king whose reputation exceeded his presence, and whose military brilliance could not substitute for the institutional foundations he neglected.
Richard the Lionheart built a legend that lasted 800 years, but could not build a government that lasted 8, and that gap between image and institution is the true measure of his reign.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power approach slowly. Until next time, stay with us.